Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Ontario Energy Collaborative Association members and guests. More will be arriving soon, but glad to see the people who are showing up, and thank you for your attendance. For those that haven't met me, I'm Rick Baker, and I'm founding chair for Ontario Energy Collaborative Association. As a quick introduction, Ontario Energy Collaborative Association was created last year, and we had our official launch on January the 16th. The purpose of our organization is to provide a forum and a platform for leaders of energy businesses in Ontario to share their viewpoints, share information that support their viewpoints, and collaborate on innovative energy solutions and projects. On behalf of the steering committee, which have Tanya, Nino, Marc-Antoine, Ian, Jack, and myself, I'm pleased to introduce our first event, webinar conversation. The webinar is being recorded and for future use by Ontario Energy Collaborative Association. If you have any questions, place them in the chat. There's not a lot of other housekeeping things that need to be said, but I want to start off saying I have the pleasure to introduce two of the OECA, Ontario Energy Collaborative Association founding members, and they are going to engage in an informal conversation. And this is Marc-Antoine Joly, and occasionally I will call him Marc. That's the name we had when we first met, and Dan Mathieson, who I will always call Dan because that's the name he had when we first met, and both of these fellows have an immense range of experience, etc. Would like to spend a lot of time introducing them, but I think it's better that we get on with the conversation. So I'm going to limit some of my introduction to a few bullet points. I'll start with Dan. Dan has achieved significant governance and community success, serving 27 years on the Stratford City Council and being mayor for 5 terms. That shows people liked him and he was doing some good work. Dan has served on many boards, including chairing our Municipal Property Assessment Corporation. He's now the managing director of Carey Management, a strategic advisory firm, and he's providing clients with invaluable insights into the intersection of government and business. Dan has received many awards for his contributions in Ontario. I won't be able to list them all, but I do want to mention that a couple of them included Queen Elizabeth II Diamond and Gold and Jubilee medals. Dan is founding member of Ontario Energy Collaborative Association, as I mentioned earlier, and today he will share stories and advice tied to his recent experiences in Dubai. Now up for Marc-Antoine. Marc-Antoine is a bilingual professional engineer with 25 years of experience in Ontario's energy sector. Marc has brought dynamic leadership to cross-functional teams covering a full range of management and operation activities from sustainability, asset management to innovative ideas and solutions. His career experiences include energy leadership at Maple Leaf Foods, VIP Energy Services, CBRE Limited, University of Ottawa, and now with GHD. Marc-Antoine's a founding member of Ontario Energy Collaborative Association as well, and he volunteered and now chairs OECA's events committee. And it was Marc's idea to hold this event for the first one, and I applaud him for the idea. Today, Marc-Antoine will share thoughts tied to his Ontario and international experiences. Discussions will cover innovation and strategies for the transportation, building, and other sectors of the marketplace here in Ontario. Now I'm going to turn it over to Marc to introduce the conversation that will form this webinar. Thanks again, everyone, for your attendance.
Absolutely. So, I mean, just from a general theme standpoint, what we'd like to bridge is, and it's kind of to marry up the two different aspects of the subject, which is COP28 and some of the policies and initiatives that are happening globally within our environments, and then translating it to the Ontario marketplace. From my experience, it's more the operational, I can't really say it, operationally of our operational, you guys know what I'm saying. The operationalization of the actual policies that are being put in place. Man, I struggled with that one. Can you tell I'm French? Dan, I wanted to pass it over to you and really just, if you could just get us started and say, hey, how did you get to Dubai? What were the key themes and what were the things that most fascinated you? And hopefully we can just get started on that discussion.
Sure, Mark. So I had the opportunity to go to Dubai as part of Project Aero, which is the Auto Parts Manufacturers Association zero emission autonomous car. It was tested in Stratford during my time as mayor, and conceived in that situation. Now, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, it got cut short. But Jeff Graham and the team at Festival Hydro and Uzni Samsudini before him were great partners. And I've stayed on the advisory board. So we were taking it to Dubai to showcase on behalf of the Canadian government, as part of its international tour, that in Ontario, there is the opportunity to produce world-leading electrification of vehicles with all parts that could be made here in Canada, and the opportunity to have zero emission. So it was one of those great chances to tell some stories. Now, when we were there, that allowed us the opportunity to be part of the Canadian delegation, and we took part in a lot of the mobility summit. Now, I had the opportunity to speak to Todd Smith, the Minister of Energy for the province of Ontario, because it was part of his world tour. He started off in the UK, went on to Paris, and then down to Dubai, where he was looking at different nuclear systems. Amazed at the coming together and the number of people that were in Dubai for that period of time, roughly 2.5 weeks. And it was the former World Fair grounds reused as the site for COP28. And, you know, for somebody who'd never been to Dubai, it was amazing to see the development that has occurred there, the westernization that has occurred there, but also still mixing in the religious aspects of being in a Middle East state. And so you had everything from women in traditional garb to people walking down the streets in t-shirts, flip-flops, and sandals. And it was a coming together of the nation to talk about a lot of the interesting things. And, you know, Mark, I'll get into more detail, but it was one of those once-in-a-lifetime opportunities to be part of the Canadian delegation and to realize how many different aspects that Canada was advocating for while they were there. And, you know, really at the end of the day, one example was Canada had committed to declare triple nuclear energy with all of them, with all the countries, to triple their nuclear output as a way to deal with some of the climate issues.
That's great. Were there any other insights other than the energy generation piece of things with respect to utilization and reduction?
The other piece was that I found interesting was that when we talked about mobility, you know, we really think of the Middle East as being committed to oil or fossil fuels, which is not the case whatsoever. I had the opportunity to meet with Nasser Ahmad Al Sawadi, His Excellency. He's a former chair of the National Bank of Dubai in Abu Dhabi. His grandfather was one of the founders of the UAE in 1973. And they were very interested, and they are making great investments through their family office, investment office, in smart mobility. So they are looking at electrification and battery. They're looking at how they can take solar in the desert, store that energy, and then put it back onto the grid. And they're working on those types of investments. So I think for many of us, you know, who go there, we believe that the Middle East is committed to fossil fuels. I think one of the things we're going to be foolhardy if we don't understand is that they're actually making investments in areas where they're going to be able to, for the betterment of a phrase, eat our lunch in a couple of years if we're not careful. The Western governments talk about climate change. I'm not sure we're making the same number of investments in research and development that they are, but they are trying to find ways to do it. And then there's other aspects of COP28, not just in energy, but desalinization of water supply systems and other aspects of climate change, where they realize the fresh water ability for us, for many nations, is going away, and desalinization and seeing if there's an energy component to it is going to actually propel them in areas probably within 15 to 20 years.
Yeah. It's interesting to see how the old dichotomy associated with, you know, the old world or petroleum worlds seems to be dissociating much more quickly than anybody ever really thought, right? I mean, that's what we thought of the UAE. I think we all thought similar aspects of Texas, and they're, you know, more than half of their overall production is renewables now, and they've really shied away from the fossil fuel energy sector. It's really quite motivating to see some of those changes and some of the things that are happening. I mean, whether it be renewable natural gas or nuclear or whatever else, there are a lot of opportunities out there for us to be able to generate and hopefully distribute, which I think is part of the crux of the whole deal, right? I think we can generate the electricity, and I think we know where. It's just a matter of how we distribute it as fairly and openly as possible, so that it's available for everyone.
One of the things I found interesting, we talked a lot about the global cooling pledge that occurred there, and there was a lot of talk about methane. And it wasn't just about methane being bad. It was, what can you recapture and use the methane for? And how can that actually make a difference? Geothermal, geoheating, geocooling was something that was discussed at extensive lengths in some of the sessions. I had the opportunity in a breakout session with Minister Guilbeault, the Canadian Environment Minister, at a reception where he talked greatly about the need for geothermal. I think here in Canada, we've talked about it for a very long time. There are some grants available as it relates, but in my own community of Stratford, where we talk about geothermal being great as a Canadian pledge, as a worldwide opportunity to use heating and cooling of the Earth's surface. But at the end of the day, some municipalities still don't allow geothermal fields. They look at horizontal drilling, not vertical drilling, and some of the things that can expedite and help us in that. And so, they're just not looking at, identifying problems with all our different heating sources. They're actually talking about solutions that could be achieved by harnessing the other side of them. And so, when I think of, there was a report released there, and I haven't digested it completely, called An Eye on Methane. It was all about, what methane's being used for in the world today, but what are the byproducts of it and what could actually come from it as we try to harness some of it. So, to say that it was just a problem identification session was not really the case whatsoever.
That's incredible. I mean, from Ontario's perspective, in terms of ground source heat pumps, and I know because I've installed enough of them. The Canadian Shield's always the ever present obstacle, but it's not meant to be an excuse. The reality is that there's a lot of other things. If you take the time to take a look at the geology and what advantages that we do have, that stability also leans it to us installing significantly more plants of that nature in the area or in select areas altogether. I don't know if there was any other aspects or buzz around deep lake cooling or any other type of free cooling, or was that sort of pushed to the side and hasn't really been talked about in the last 10 years since Enwave?
It wasn't. I'd tell you that the big 5 takeaways was, first, loss and damage. So there was a lot of conversation around climate. What is the loss and the damage that were occurring, and putting a value on it by the World Bank. And I think it was important to talk about that, because in Dubai alone, they've committed $650 million already into a fund to start working on loss and damage, on things they should be doing or changing to try to make that. So I think when we think about climate change in the southern U.S., we always hear about hurricanes and the damage that occurs. We talk about the frequency of those storms increasing. We talk about the ferocity of the storms increasing. Well, other parts of the world, they're now trying to quantify it and then figure out what it costs to do it, and then what it would be better off to spend that money at in fighting climate change as opposed to paying insurance premiums and rebuilding things. So that was interesting. The other piece then, flowing from that, because finance took a center stage at this whole piece, the World Bank started talking about climate finance targets, how countries should start to put dollar values on how much of the climate change and initiatives that they need to finance as part of their ongoing GDP. And, much like we do with NATO and defense spending, they're now saying, countries are falling behind on their aspect of what they need to spend on climate finance targets. So ahead of COP29 in 2025, that is something that they have committed to actually move forward on, and to start looking at adopting it as a national standard. And the World Bank will take a standard or a forefront in it. And I think it's important that they do that, because as we see in the world today, there are more and more sources of information that people look to. As journalism dies away, we're going to see people with a keyboard figure out they're the next journalist. And we know that that's not the case. So institutions like the World Bank and others, as much as they're going to be called elitist and globalist and all those things, they need to take a forefront and provide us some information and guidance, because I really feel that's one of the ways we're going to be able to move forward. And then the next one, yeah, go ahead.
Dan, just before you keep going on, because you're hitting some awesome points here, definitely gonna come back and cycle back on the resiliency piece, because I think that's part of the core design, right? It's not just financial, it's also part of the design from an engineering standpoint, trying to make sure and make clear that sort of the old standards, whether it be, designing for extreme heat or extreme cold or swings thereof with respect to the freeze thaw cycle, those are all things that are incorporated now more and more in design and obviously need to be factored. Those small incremental costs do come and make a huge difference. Going back to the financial aspect of things, I mean, people have been throwing around setting aside between 3 and 5% of their GDP for these major events that are going to be coming more frequently. I think to your point, though, the investment on the resilience side, instead of insurance, instead of this, that, and everything else, really should be able to minimize and should be part and parcel of the decarbonization and the rest of the sustainability goals that we're pushing forward. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but these are really, really heavy and hefty subjects, right?
Yeah, for sure. And, when you start talking about putting a dollar value on the GDP side, that's an interesting, target for us as a government to start thinking about how are we going to put that type of money aside? What are we spending on catastrophic claims already? And what is the infrastructure deficit of our cities and our country already? And that's a confluence of very deep understanding of institutional systems that we have in government. And I think what it's really going to call on is a new order. I think we keep pulling at the edges of climate change. We talk about all these pieces, but somebody needs to come in and stack them all and come up with a comprehensive plan on how they all integrate. And I'll get.
It's funny you were going down that line, because that's exactly what I was thinking in terms of prioritization. It could be geographical in nature, depending on the risk or the level of risk, but there's also different things where it'd be nice to do certain things, but may not add as much value and should be prioritized differently. So that's absolutely key as well. I mean, it works in an organization as much as a country, right?
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that was interesting to see over there, we talk about carbon markets and carbon trading and all those, but it's really not at a national or international level well understood or regulated. And so as every country or sets of countries start to develop carbon credits, buying and selling of them, somehow we need to actually really align those financial incentives with actually emission reducing projects. And we have to have a standard around the world as it relates to it. And I think that's going to be interesting to see how the supervision of them is set up, whether it's through the World Bank or some other organization, so that the key questions related to the permanent reductions that are occurring and removals claimed, how they actually will help us achieve those goals. From what I understand at COP28, that again is going to be something that comes forward to say, look, we need to have a worldwide standard of what the carbon market's going to look like. We're going to need to make sure that multinational companies that are dealing in carbon credits aren't pitting certain parts of the world off against others and trying to trade credits where they get higher value. Because if they're doing it to get higher value, sometimes it's just to skirt the reinvestment they need to make into it. And so what they're trying to do is make sure the degradation doesn't happen in different parts of the world because people have found a way to skirt the rules. And that's where I talk about New World Order, understanding how they integrate together, and then making sure that we're all moving together in lockstep.
Well, I mean, I'd love to build on that, because from the business perspective, we're also hearing it as well. I mean, whether you're talking about sustainability, ESG, carbon trading, whatever it may be, obviously these are all burgeoning industries within them. And to your point, everybody's sort of set up their own standards. Now we're at a point of requiring that convergence, to your point, to an international standard, whether it be IFRS or whatever it may be from, and I'm talking about ESG right now more than sustainability, but the idea is to solidify that framework so that everybody's working towards that same goal and not varying the interpretation based on geography.
Yeah, for sure. And, when we talk about how we're going to move in that direction as we head to 2029, COP29, I just don't understand. We talked about 20 to 25 being our peak fossil fuel consumption time here in the world. But I'm not sure actually how the 1.5% or 1.5 degrees Celsius warming that we're seeing, how they're actually going to pre-industrial levels, how they're going to meld this all together into a strategy, because different parts of the world have different development stages that they're in. We're a very mature market here in North America as it relates to industrial development, but for other parts of the world, they look at us and say, well, you know, it was good enough for you guys to have that great boon of growth after the Second World War, and definitely through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where your industrial revolution occurred. Why can't our country actually be given the same opportunity? And I think that's one of the challenges that's going to have to be dealt with, because some of the other countries in the world are not willing to give up their time to develop their markets and develop their standard of living.
Absolutely. I'm just going to answer the question that's in the chat right now with respect to Jeff's comments on the on renewable natural gas, or what they're calling blue natural gas. There are a number of items that we're currently working on, and in terms of energy futures with Canada as well. I know that there are a number of things that are being worked on with respect to potentially even conversion of ammonia and liquid natural gas in terms of exports. So combining sort of the agricultural requirements and the energy requirements together with distribution terminals and a lot of different aspects. They are coming to Canada. Actually, I've actually got an energy futures discussion later this evening specifically on that with respect to renewable natural gas, and we'll definitely be doing a session on that later that fact. So Dan, before we move on or go back, depending on which way you look at it, I do want to talk about resilience, but why don't we go back to the beginning for a second with respect to your transition in mobility. So when we talk about sustainable mobility, when we talk about Project Arrow, what are we talking about in terms of how we're seeing that change? I mean, there's 20 billion parking spots in the U.S. today. Realistically, we only need maybe about a billion if we were able to really try to liken it. These are all certain, I'm going to say, these small increments that we can start acting on or start thinking of as we're planning our next changes. Any ideas in terms of how that might look?
Well, first, I think, you know, the target that we see a lot of countries setting, and Canada being one of them, around electrification of our vehicle. There's a disconnect between what you can do there as it relates to our grid. And I think we already have a problem with the Ontario electricity grid as it relates to 2027, 2028, with the closing of Pickering and how they are actually going to start the refurb and how we're going to deal with that. In January of this past year, Todd Smith on the 9th sent IESO President and CEO Leslie Gallinger a letter to talk about new opportunities they needed to explore. You know, that's coming at us very quick. We need to be careful that we don't try to electrify our vehicle fleet before our distribution network can handle it. So there needs to be a more robust strategy around it. I think it's going to be one of the challenges first, is to see the maturity of the electrification of the vehicles, because I had a very poor experience with a Cadillac Lyric electric vehicle back in January on a very, very cold day, which, you know, I left Stratford to go to Exeter, Ontario. I picked up the Lyric. It had 406 kilometers of range. And my day was to consist of going to Exeter for a meeting, which is 36 kilometers from Stratford, back to Stratford, and then on to the Royal York for a meeting, followed by drinks and dinner, and then come home that night. So I leave for Exeter, 405 kilometers. I go there and back, which is roughly 72, 75 kilometers. By the time I get back, I'm down to range of 250. Why? Because it's minus 16 degrees. I had the seat heater on. I had my phone plugged in. So I take a gamble. I get in the car, and it's 153 kilometers from my house to the Royal York. And I get there with 11 kilometers to spare. And I pull into the Royal York, and they have a whole bunch of chargers. And I get there at 3:30 in the afternoon, and I give them the car and ask them to charge it for me. Now, I don't know enough because it's my first time driving an electric vehicle. I don't ask them whether I'm going on a supercharger, how many kilowatt hours it gets in. But I think I'm going to be there for 4 to 4.5 hours. That should be lots. I come out, I was on an 8 kilowatt hour charger, and I'm now up to 172 kilometers is what I've got. And I got a 153-kilometer ride. It's even colder now. And I get on the 401 and I'm watching this thing drop like a stone. And I panic and barely get to Cambridge, Ontario, and then sit at a supercharger there where I didn't have the right app loaded on my phone, had to load it up, buy some time to then sit there for almost 45 minutes to an hour to get some time to get home. And I'll tell you, I walked out of the Royal York shortly after 8. On a good day, I would have been home by 10 o'clock at night. I didn't get home till midnight by the time I skirted around and worried about all this whole thing. So I think the model and the moral of the story here, we have a long way to go. 1, to educate the public. 2, to build out the infrastructure. 3, to get the technology and the bugs out of the system. And then 4, figure out how our distribution network is actually going to be able to handle fleets of vehicles being charged simultaneously. And then lastly, how do we actually get people to look at mobility as a service, where I maybe don't need to have 4 cars parked in my driveway, 1 for each driver, but how we can actually all either rent or use a vehicle on any given day we need it. And I think that puts us somewhere between 20 to 30 years before we're going to be at that. And the first daunting task is to actually have our grid system work.
Yeah. So, I mean, to your point, I think that we have a vision. I think that there are ways to get there, but to your point, through that education, through that learning curve, I think there's going to be a lot of things, whether it be our clients directly. I mean, when you're looking at long haul or even short haul, if you're not just talking about the last mile, electrification of the fleet is not necessarily feasible for most companies just yet. There's other aspects that need to be factored in. And this is where we really make sure that people understand that as much as having a net zero target or a net zero sort of aspiration is a great thing, there are ways to do that so that you can step change through it and make sure that your buildings are net zero ready, do some adaptation, and make sure that you're beginning those steps so that when we do get to that stage, when we do get the distribution ironed out, that we're able to do that. And looking at alternate methods such as microgrid and some of the other aspects or local generation, maybe alternates or intermediary methods. Now, you and I have both lived this. When you're talking to an Ontario LDC and you're asking for an extra megawatt in terms of overall capacity, and the transformer's already maxed out to your local distribution, you're talking about 7 to 10 years before you even get that feed, let alone be able to ensure that it's stability, right? Obviously, there's a lot of business cases that come in between that. That doesn't mesh with the 2030 sort of aspirations of a lot of the changes that we're making. So I think probably the 15 to 20 years is correct. Knowing that we've got that gap, what do we do in the interim? Because climate change is not going to stop. And there are other aspects that we need to make sure that we're staying on top of. So there's a little bit of hurry up and run before we get to the back end of this. What are you seeing in terms of the distribution from the LDCs? Or is this, I mean, based on the report from the Ministry of Energy, mostly on the ISO and some of our equal responsibilities around this table to try and push this forward?
Well, you know, there's far greater members of the collaborative who have experience on that, but just knowing my own time in being the mayor and owning an electric utility, knowing the challenges that are on the distribution network in this province, I think we're still needing to come to terms with what we need to do in that area. And then we have to look at whether or not distributive energy storage, microgridding is something we're going to invest in. One of the best examples I kind of came across was when we decided we were going to go into the battery manufacturing piece for mobility. You know, the LG Stellantis facility down in Windsor, the IESO and OPG had to bring back on a transformer station that they had already mothballed. They had to get new transformers ordered. St. Thomas is going to be the same challenge. Now we have everything going through the lens of, okay, if these 2 facilities are coming on in 2027, what other industries can we allow to actually come into Ontario, or what growth can we allow to occur on those distribution corridors? And are they fed from Sir Adam Beck, or are they fed from Bruce Nuclear as they head to that part of the province? So, you know, there's a lot of these questions that I think we as a group can start to evaluate. And I think it'd be interesting for us to talk about how it affects us. In Stratford, as an example, we won it in the late 2009, 2010. We were looking at bringing the RBC data center, the national data center. They were moving out of Toronto. We wanted to put it in Stratford. Our transformer station was controlled by Hydro One. They did not see it as a priority to invest in new transformer upgrades in Stratford. And we were hell-bent not to lose the opportunity for that industry and that investment. So we actually built our own transformer station on the opposite side of town. It's fed in both directions by Beck and Bruce. And we actually built our own. And through the RBC investment, we've been able to pay that off already in 12 years. And I can tell you, if we waited for Hydro One to make the investments they need, we go into a mix of where they're trying to prioritize provincial strategy dollars, their grid availability and distribution network versus what communities can do. And not every community has the debt capacity or the utility does to go build their own TS. But those are the types of challenges that we're going to see to continue to exist when we battle through where is investment going to occur, how is it going to be financed, and what's the long-term growth of it look like. And I think for us, we need to look at the investments they're making at Pickering and other, Bruce last week with the federal dollars, but how is that energy going to get to market? And are there not microgridding opportunities that we could actually look at, like compressed air storage and different other aspects that we could actually do? And then, you think about what happened with the province. They allowed municipalities the chance to veto more natural gas production. And some of their bigger projects have all been vetoed by local governments. And it's left the province sitting there now trying to figure out how they're going to get some of this capacity back on. And the 40-year IESO contract, I think, will allow many of these types of projects to be financed and funded that could be microgridding in nature.
Would you see privatization of those transformer stations as well in the short term while the government's trying to catch up? Or
yeah, no, I think that's where we need to go. There's pension funds and different vehicles that need a rate of return that would look at a 40-year IESO contract as a good rate of return, and they'd be willing to put the capital in. That will then allow the province to decide where they're going to put the capital in, whether that allows them some capacity to fund improvements to the distribution network, whether it allows them the opportunity to continue to invest in nuclear, whether it allows us to put money into new innovative generation opportunities. So there's only so much money. So we just have to figure out where the capital markets lie, or where pension funds and investments can get a regulated rate of return that's good for those investments, but then allow us to make the strategic long-term investments that allow us to adopt some of the technologies like smart mobility to permeate and become ubiquitous.
I mean, it's really interesting that you're going in that direction there with the generator, with the distribution piece. It'll be interesting to see, although the ink is still wet on this whole deal, what the appetite is to really uptake this and deliver these capital plans like they did in Alberta to a certain extent and in BC.
Yeah. One of the areas that I've started to study is long duration storage. If there's, ways that we can store some of it. Batteries aren't the only opportunity or aspect for us. Maybe it's time we start looking at some of the geologic features that are in the province of Ontario today, that are in smaller areas that could produce some megawatts for us, that could allow us or give us some breathing room on spending high amounts of money on new distribution and production by using some of our geologic features.
Was there any discussion with respect to manufacturing or production of a lot of these things? I mean, I think you and I have both been on the tail end of having to order a significant amount of transformer material, and you're talking about 6 to 8 months in terms of lead time. Is there any talk through Schneider or some of the bigger guys, Siemens, Eaton, that would be promising in that stretch? I have not heard a lot about that, actually.
I didn't hear a lot about it. I saw them all at COP28. They all talk about how they want to be part of it. But it's almost one of those strategic pieces where the government needs to think about, if we're going to move in this direction, should we be partnering in some of these aspects with these the Schneiders and Siemens and some of them to make sure that we are actually getting access to some of the important pieces of infrastructure we need. You know, we've done it to protect lithium production and make sure that it has value added before it leads the country as it relates to battery. But if we don't actually have the ability to distribute energy, we're also going to be looking at it. So I think there was a time when government looked at certain parts of procurement and industry as strategic for sovereignty. And I think energy is starting to head in that way as well. And it's the same as what I say about telecommunications and the use of fiber. It's as important today as clean water, sanitary and storm sewers are, and hydroelectric distribution and access. And that's what fiber is today, so we connect to the web. The same is going to occur with being able to produce a lot of those aspects that we need.
Couple of questions. I don't know if you want to go over Dan Gary Wright or Gary White, sorry. Was the issue of China, India, South America, et cetera, is it challenging if everyone does not take on targets equally? Sorry, equality and world standards was at the view of the conference.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that we saw, you know, where I talked about trying to get World Bank and them to develop standards with regard to carbon credits and developing standards that are world adopted. You might need to see them take that one step further, similar to what we do with whether things are CSA approved or UL approved or ULC approved, having international standards line up. I think at some point we're going to have to do that with different aspects of the world, whether it be India and China and goods and services they produce, so that they actually have to adhere to some standard the rest of us adopt. And but the problem is, as I go back to say it, they argue that we had our industrial revolution time to build a middle class, and you know, now it's theirs, and we want to change the rules. I think that's going to be the issue, but it only works when the world comes together and the vast majority of us declare on where we want to stand. But let's not forget BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India and China control the vast amount of the world population as well.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting. And the emergence with the African continent as well, right? I mean, there's a lot of presence coming in from Nigeria and South Africa that are really making some waves across the technology fields. There was a question from Stefan about wind and solar, which we didn't really touch on. I guess that was the one renewable that we really didn't touch on.
Well, you know, I think wind and solar still has a place to play. There was not a lot of discussion around it. I actually went to the desert while I was there, saw it in place. They are augmenting it very, very well with the use of battery technology over there. And I think we need to think about that as well. That's where long duration storage could come in here in Ontario. Give you an idea, I'm aware of a project that has abandoned gas wells where they'd like to put wind above, compress or fill the geologic base with air or compression, and then to release at a time back onto the grid through a generator, which would allow us to use some of the Earth's geologic formations. So there is that opportunity. But, you know, it's funny, we often say, well, it's unproven technology. Well, it's unproven technology here. It's been used in other parts of the world. And maybe we need to start with one and anecdotally review it qualitative and quantitatively, and then see if that allows us to move in a direction, as opposed to just saying it's not proven, so therefore we don't do it.
I find that's an ongoing theme, that we seem to be afraid of cutting our teeth on some of this, to your point, globally proven technology into our industry, just simply because we're unfamiliar with it.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're short-circuiting a lot of those investments.
Short-circuiting or leapfrogging?
Well, leapfrogging, but we're also saying, look, we could do that, but that seems like it could take us 5 years to prove, or some research involved, or some leap of faith. So let's just go past it, and let's see if there's a better technology. But you know, that might, long duration storage using geological areas might actually be a way that we could be online by 2028 to deal with our grid situation.
I mean, the clock is ticking there for sure. I mean, from the industry standpoint, in terms of attracting new business, to your point, and being selective with that, there's definitely going to be an economic crunch within that sector. I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit on that, but then we can move into a little bit more infrastructure. But yeah, I'm happy that Ian put that in there. Australia is looking at that and quite advanced with respect to those that storage, and it is working quite well. I'm fortunate enough working for an Australian company that we've got our hand in that the energy futures on that. But it is definitely interesting to see the technology. But again, with these global companies, exporting that technology, exporting that experience becomes a lot more realistic today than it ever has.
Yeah, and Jeff just made a good point. Maybe we need to stop trying to reinvent the wheel and start adopting some proven technologies from other nations. And I think that's one of the things that will actually help us maybe deal with the energy gap and move in a more brisk pace. And that's where international standards and maybe starting to adopt other people's research is not a bad thing.
Yep. Actually, this one's probably a little bit more along your lines in terms of innovation. So what are you describing is how we do and how we fund innovation in Canada. Even in Alberta, where I live, this is Donna, it's difficult for some community-led initiatives for long-term storage to access funding for ideas. Waiting for big companies to do this isn't always working. And that's exactly, it's funny because that's exactly the brainchild of why Rick is come to this conclusion is the medium and small companies, the medium and small businesses are going to be playing a much larger role. And what we want to do is make sure that that community hears that message and gets the ideas, the help, so that they can get started on those aspects. I think that's really a key aspect, is moving it from the big fish that are currently participating into something more realistic where everybody can be a disruptor. And I think that's become more and more of a fact over the course of the last, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years, especially with COVID and some of the learning associated with that. Self-reliance, independence, and just generally in terms of being able to sustain.
Well, here in Ontario, I think corporate interests win out. You think about who the investors are in some of the biggest nuclear programs here in the province. You've got to overcome the likes of Bruce Nuclear, who are very much driving energy policy and investment here in the province of Ontario. They're owned by OMERS, which is one of the province's largest investment, or one of their largest investors is OMERS, who is one of the province's largest partners in infrastructure. There's a lot of corporate interests that are driving the agenda based on where they want to make investments. And the challenge is you can't marry them up with local government and local innovation. And so it's incumbent on the government to foster that growth and that innovation at a local level. Stratford back in 2009 put ubiquitous Wi-Fi over the entire city. That was done because as a response to Dalton McGuinty's smart meter program that saw communities either putting a megahertz radio system in each meter, a cellular chip in each meter, and we kind of, as a community, went, that's yesterday's technology. All we're doing is investing in something that hasn't been proven. So we went out and built a ubiquitous network over the city, backed it up with a backbone of almost 80 some kilometers of fiber, 300 wireless mesh network over the city. And that's how we did it. And then it had unintended consequences along the way. It allowed us to do a secure network for our doctors' portals with the hospital and our health teams. It allowed us to do autonomous vehicle testing. It allowed us to actually enter into the telecommunications game and sell wireless or Wi-Fi internet services in the community. That's the type of innovation we took on as a community, but it wasn't because we got any amount of government funding. And why did Stratford bury 1 gig fiber to every home that was just completed? Because we couldn't get Rogers or Bell or Shaw or anybody to do it. They'd do the new neighborhoods. They wouldn't do the old. And Jeff Graham and the crew at Rhizome, which is owned by Festival Hydro, made the investment. And unfortunately, we don't reward innovation at the local level, but truly that's where this innovation starts. If you can get communities to adopt it, it's where it'll take hold and foster. If we wait for big amounts of government to do innovation and fund it, we are going to be up against corporate, private interests, pension funds who are going to drive the agenda based on what their agenda is. And it's not a knock against Bruce or Omers. It's just trying to figure out where communities can play.
It's a fact of life, right? I mean, and then they'll be holding that infrastructure and then continuing that cycle where we've got an opportunity to disrupt it. And again, to your point, really change the message. The Wi-Fi example is absolutely primary, right? I mean, this is where you're displacing a lot of the infrastructure, the wiring that you used to do, where the capability with IoT and just generally mesh networks and how you're able to protect them, what you're able to really get out of your buildings today. So, I mean, when I think 20 years ago or so, when we were starting to talk about smart meters and some of the information, and I think about the information that I can get now on a daily basis or even on just real time, it's completely different. It's changed the way that we think about how we're dealing with these shortfalls. What I mean, and it can be as simple as demand response, but I think it can go all the way up to your point, better coordination and implementation of newer technologies and newer ideas that are coming down the line. And then, sorry, so just moving on to through that, Dan, there's a lot of stuff with respect to technology. So, I mean, that's really kind of the next tranche of decarb. I think a lot of the base things have been done and time again. I think that if a consultant comes up to us and said, hey, you've got to replace your lights, I think we'd all roll our eyes at this point. Everybody has converted to LEDs. Everybody has gone to be more efficient. How they use and integrate the various systems, not just from a daylighting standpoint, from an occupancy standpoint, from building automation and turn back, but also being able to optimize for peak usage or sudden usage without affecting the broader network or the neighboring networks is really where things are moving down the line. So there's a lot of sophistication that is going to be required ahead of the deployment or the full electrification. I think this is where there's a tremendous opportunity for our small and medium-sized businesses to come up with some ideas that are going to be sort of sparsed within the shotgun approach, if you will, of energy conservation, decarbonization, and general sustainability. But I think those are all important pieces where every dollar invested and returned, because those are high investment, high return choices, are going to lead to reductions in the overall capital and the deployment crunch that we're currently facing. I don't know if you'd want to chime in on that or if there's something else you'd like to add. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can unpack there. Just conscious on time in terms of what we're going to be able to cover, and we still have a couple of things that we wanted to tackle.
No, I don't really have anything else I wanted to add along that. Why don't we, is there a chance we could open up for more questions? I think, we've got 25 people in the chat. Is there anything more anyone wants to kind of get us talking about or on?
Yeah, I mean, in the intro, there's a bunch of stuff that I'm thinking of, but with respect to green buildings and building materials, there's a lot of things that you're speaking to. I mean, the renewal of the Pickering plant is top of mind. The reality is that plant, if it does get renewed or however that gets refurbished, is going to be around for yet another 50 years. Is that going to be sufficient? Is that the way that we want to go? And I think it lightens a lot to the opportunity that you were speaking of a minute ago. Is we don't want to reinvent the wheel. There's certain things that we can rely on from other countries. I think we have not had the discussions about how we can intelligently do that yet, but I'm encouraged to see that discussion is coming along.
Yeah, I think, when we think about COP28, and that's what we started gathering about, I left there with a little bit stronger feeling that world order and understanding of how this was all fitting together was on the agenda, that we weren't just disparate parts, different countries, different continents. It's not the G7s taking ideas versus others. I really got the sense that somebody was trying to put everything in order and make sure that we were all on the same page, which gives me a lot more comfort than maybe I had in the past, which I felt like Canada was running out front to try to get ahead in certain areas, but we're falling behind in others. And I'm still not sold that the Americans are as committed to the program as we need them to be as neighbors and partners who share a grid in some cases, who share airflow and a lot of those other pieces. And then, ultimately, I was really worried about as it relates to China and India, some of the other developing nations, whether they're as committed to the program as we are. And I think, when we put all that together, then we need to start looking at our investments, longer term investments. So Pickering only being 50 years doesn't scare me, because the amount of time it's going to take us to get some of this stuff approved, or whether we decide to go to microgridding and some of these other areas, might actually save us from doing another large scale Pickering type project.
Yeah, fair enough. I think that'll naturally float up altogether. Sorry, Stefan is just clarifying his question, as the initial question being more about the future wind and solar in Ontario with respect to the blend. And there's the combination here with respect to Peaks and Valley bridging, obviously, with respect to both of those sources.
Donna's point there with regard to being able to lead, in Ontario being able to lead, is a good one. But I'll tell you what, that policy started because of Flavio Volpe and the auto parts manufacturers driving that. They decided to actually go out and do that vehicle. And it was only after they started down that path that government ran to the front to make it look like they were leading the parade and started putting some money into it. Flavio's right now in intake for Aero 2.0, which is not just to build one car, which they have, is to build 20 and have different applications. And they're intaking, they had over 500 companies apply last time. They expect it'll be closer to 700 or 800 this time with different pieces of technology. And, they still have not been able to secure from the federal government or the Ontario government an investment in Aero 2.0. Now, both of those governments enjoyed having their picture taken with the car whenever they could. And it's been showcased at pavilions of the Canadian government around the world. And it was at it's been at different Ontario government pavilions. But really, I think for us to make sure our technology is heading in the right direction, government needs to make sure that we are supporting them so that the type of manufacturing we do has relevance in the future economy. And if we are going to see an electrification of vehicle and automotive and mobility, that we are actually leading it as opposed to trying to catch up to it. And I think the APMA has actually done a wonderful job doing that.
Yeah. And you see that shooting off as well. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think anybody really cares who takes credit for it, as long as we just achieve what we're trying to set out. And oftentimes you do need to get some successes before you get that backing. It is difficult. I don't know if Luke mentioned microgrids and DERs. In terms of the regulatory changes associated with that, would there be any other lobbying for virtual net metering or microgrids within our communities, allowing smaller utilities to make it work for them and the city rather than the ratepayers?
Yeah, so I think what we probably at the collaborative network here needs to do is identify a lot of those sources. The electrical distribution group, EDC, has already kind of laid out what they think we need to be doing, and I think we need to support those. They're a collection of, let's call it 90 utilities from across the province, large and small, and they have a very good understanding of what their communities could use. And I think we need to start making sure that some of our solutions start to become more localized, because I don't feel that the solution of one size fits all is going to work in the future. And there are certain aspects that I think could benefit us greatly. Down in the Windsor area, for example, they have a lot of solar down there. Have we ever looked at the capacity of solar and storage, what it could do to handle the production needs of that region from an economic development standpoint? Have we ever looked at what hydroelectric capacity could do in the GTHA as it relates to Sir Adam Beck 1 and 2 and the tunnel under the city. We always look at our problems as what are we feeding into the overall system, but have we ever broken it down into more regions? And I think that might be something that we need to look at doing in the future.
But even the cross-pollination between industries, and you're sort of alluding to that to a certain aspect, right? I mean, Windsor's a great example where the amount of greenhouses and carbon sequestration for accelerated growth and agricultural or food security could potentially go hand in hand to solve each other's problems and really start to optimize. I mean, that's an example of a million that I can think of off the top of my head there, Dan, but.
Yeah, for sure. And that, I think that's the opportunity that we have here with the network, is actually starting to have these discussions and then figure out what are the best things that we can take from different organizations and how can we help advance the portfolio. Nobody is, I would say, collaboratively having these large scale discussions, whether it's producers like Luke's company who do a great job in Southwestern Ontario, whether it's hydroelectric utilities that are doing a very good job with what they're doing, whether we've got users, manufacturers. We need to start having those discussions and really holistically come up with a broader game plan to what we're trying to achieve.
Through innovation and through those communications. I mean, obviously that's where you really get the biggest ideas. I think the one thing that I've learned through my career is the more industries that I get familiar with, the more I realize that there's so much that we can learn from each other, and so many things that we've pigeonholed ourselves in, that we really need to have a different kind of discussion, an open discussion altogether in terms of what else we could do. Totally get that. Jeff's just asking in terms of the bioeconomy, in terms of the forest and hectares. I completely agree, and I think that is starting to be recognized by a lot of municipalities, and I really would like you to chime in on that one, Dan, is a lot of the municipalities are finally getting to the point where those natural assets are being investigated, are being seen, and trying to understand what is sequestered as it stands today, what the capacity might be in terms of future, and how they can optimize those biological assets.
Well, as an example, organics are a good example in Stratford. We finally put that in place. It has been tough to get a buy-in, though, from some of our residents to actually take part in the organics and the collection piece. We tried to do an organics natural gas reclaiming facility in Stratford. We were going to take the methane from our wastewater plant. We were going to add our organics to it. And our residents, who overwhelmingly tell us they're environmental stewards, said, yeah, that sounds really good. Put it somewhere else. And so you look at Stormfisher has built a facility down towards Woodstock at Plattsville, somewhere down there. Nobody seems to want them in the local communities because they're not interested in some of the challenges that go with them. So again, we're still trying to overcome figuring out technology on how we could put them locally to where the grid is. And then the other problem we had with that project is we couldn't get anyone here in Ontario to want to bid in to get our renewable natural gas. We were working with Fortis in BC, where they had a much more robust program around it. So, those are some of the, we're back to that regulatory change piece. We need to support some of those so that we can actually move forward with some of the locally produced waste and organics that could actually help solve an energy situation here.
Yeah, I know Guelph is looking at something similar as well, and it's starting to get rumblings in terms of that natural gas spinoff from methane production through wastewater. To your point, especially with the potential for production of oxygen as well, there's other means. So those primary digesters are definitely an opportunity and a source. We've got to get over the stigma that may be associated with it. No different than nuclear or anything else. A lot of it is just education, right? Rick, we're not going to have time to get to your answer, unfortunately, because we're coming up on time. I think what I'd suggest, Rick, and if you want to come back on, is we'll try and summarize the questions that have been given to us, and we'll try and make sure that we answer anything that might be that's bananas. Absolutely, Jeff. Thank you. That's absolutely hilarious. the idea here is that we're going to be able to feed back to our community. If you'd like to see anything different, if you'd like us to elaborate on any of the things, we'd love to hear your ideas, because obviously this was a first discussion, but we want to see a lot more of this to get to the points that some of the things that Dan was touching on.
If I can just say to Rick, if you're going to be talking the IESO OEB, start to look at some of their consultations that are going to occur. The IESO has been tasked with new consultations, and I think we need to make sure that we get as many innovative ideas forward into that mix quicker rather than sooner.
The output of those recommendations and the actions that the IESO need to take are definitely at the top of our minds for sure.
Well, yeah, I guess we close off here. And first of all, I want to thank everybody that attended and asked great questions to Mark and Dan. And I'd like to thank Dan and Mark for all of the answers you guys provided. And I think there's a lot of insights, a lot of stuff. We're going to have this recorded so we can transcribe it. We're going to come up with things, and we will get back to people. I think, Mark, as you mentioned, one of us, all of us, many of us will get back to people with thoughts and answers, and encourage people to follow Ontario Energy Collaborative Association. And I think, again, thanks very much for all the people that arrived and stayed throughout the whole event. That's spectacular attention spans, and I think it speaks well for the contributions that Dan and Mark provided. Lots of insights. I have lots to think about, so I want to thank everybody. And again, Dan and Mark, thanks very much. And Mark, for coming up with the idea. And there will be more events. I see a big smile on your face. More events coming. They're coming to you right now as we're speaking. So everybody have a great afternoon, and thanks very much.